Okay, so you're building up your operation, and you talked about how a lot of the best weed was coming from either Southern Oregon or Humboldt County. And I
Northern California.
remember I went to school at UC Berkeley, and I remember we took a trip to Humboldt this one time, and it was definitely a haze of, I don't think I'd ever been that high before off of weed. So it was the best stuff was coming from Humboldt at that time, and I didn't know about Oregon, but I guess it's all relatively close to each other. So
Yeah, it's all that whole forest. I think it's like the Siskiyou
yeah,
forest, and then it comes down into like the Mendocino forest. It's all pretty much connected. So Mendocino, Humboldt, and whatever county that right off the I-5 as you're coming into California. The whole entire region's economy was buffered by weed money. It was the only thing going on. We would go down to Garberville, this tiny little town. It was like the gateway to Mendocino County. And we would just rent a room for a day to make our re-up. This is where we started meeting the Mexicans that we eventually were picking up from. And a little room at like a shitty Travelodge Inn with cigarette burns in the carpet would cost you $250. It's because they knew there were millions of dollars getting passed behind those doors every day. It was a real fascinating time in the history of the drug trade.
well, yeah, you talked about how during this time, the mid 2000s, the West Coast weed wasn't reaching the East Coast yet.
Not en masse.
Right. And I remember when I read this, I had moved to New York around 2002, and I remember hanging out in the studios, and the guy was like, "Oh, you're from the West Coast? Yo, do you got a weed connect?" You know what I mean? And I by that time, I'm like, I'm nothing drug related am I even touching. No, I'm not making any phone calls. I do know some people probably, but no, I'm not touching it. But you're right. At that point, the West Coast weed wasn't hitting the East Coast yet. So you saw that as a potential market.
Absolutely, yeah. And it started getting harder and harder to turn a real profit selling domestically to drug dealers on the West Coast because there's just more and more product coming online, more people are growing. So that was like a valve to stay in business. I looked at it as like survival of the business. But then when I realized, oh no, there's millions to be had here, I'm like, we got to get this now. Because we also saw the legalization was coming.
Haha.
So that was the other thing. That was the other threat to the business.
Yeah, I remember, when was this? This was before I moved to New York, so around 2000, 2001. That's when the early stages, this was happening in Berkeley with lawyers like Tony Serra that were starting to pass the laws to make weed legal first in the Bay Area, and it started to spread.
That's right.
So you already saw it coming.
Yeah, and I think medical marijuana was already legal.
It was already there, yeah.
Yeah, it was already
you needed
there.
a card, but anyone would give you a card, so it didn't matter.
Right, exactly. So I'm like, shit, we're like 5 years out from, I looked at it, I was like, these pounds are going to be worth nothing. Like, it's going to be, everybody will have it. They're going to sell it in stores, which happened.
Yep.
And I was like, yeah, we got to make millions now. It was the opposite of how most people viewed it. They're like, once it's legal, we can pop our heads up and, market it on the internet like people do now. And we can, we can open up a dispensary and really help people. I never looked at weed as like a culture. I never was into weed culture. I think it's kind of dumb. Like, I smoked weed, but I looked at it as an outlaw business.
Yeah.
That's how I viewed it. I had no interest and I have no interest in getting into the marijuana, the cannabis industry. So it was like I was part of the last generation of like real black market weed traffickers that weren't part of a cartel, weren't part of some kind of organization. Just a guy with some balls.
Well, at one point you met some kids whose fathers were mobsters from Philadelphia.
Yep.
And you guys set up a whole operation that way?
That's right. And so that was the final shoe to drop, right? I had to connect, so I'm getting it for the low, but now I need the buyer who's going to buy it for high. So that took a couple of years to make that marriage come together. But when it did, Now I'm getting it. If I'm buying from Mexican guys, I'm getting it for like 2,000 a unit. And I'm selling it to these kids in Philly for 33 to 35. And they're picking up 10, 20 at a time. You see how that margin becomes $1 million operation quickly.
Okay. And then in 2008, you met a Mexican plug.
That's right.
So this guy was part of the cartel.
Yeah. And it was probably Sinaloa, but I don't know for sure. They don't talk like that, right? But I heard from their accents, because I speak pretty good Spanish and I've spent a lot of time in Mexico. It's a Sinaloa accent that they're talking in, right? And the slang is similar. So it was just a bunch of growers, bunch of guys that they send up north every year to hike into the fields. Like they march for hours and hours up these mountainsides in places like Humboldt. They set up these huge gardens. And then after they harvest it, trim it, they bust it down and they meet up with guys like me. And that's just how we rocked for, 2 years.
Okay. And you talked about how in weed, there really is not an extreme amount of violence like cocaine, heroin, meth, and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue there's not even a lot of violence, even in those businesses, when you reach a certain level. There's treachery, there's a lot of snitching. But stateside, I didn't see a lot of it after you ascend to a place where every deal is you're transacting millions of dollars. Everybody's a businessman at that point. And so, yeah, it was really a privilege to be able to be at that level, because most people in the drug game, and you can ask anybody that comes on your show, most people have no success, and they end up getting killed or strung out, or they go to prison early. So I felt like I had made it, because there was no violence after I met these supposedly violent cartel guys. It was just all business.
Well, you were always paying them.
Sure. And
I'm sure if you miss some payments, it might be a little different.
They always wanted to front me like double what I was picking up. So if I was picking up 50 bricks, 50 pounds, they'd always say, "Oh, take another 50, man." And I'm like, "Nah, I'm good. I'm gonna be COD," because I didn't want to owe them. Because if something gets fucked up, if I get pulled over, if I get popped or whatever, now I'm on the hook for an extra 100,000.
Okay.